The machine gun did not ask permission to reshape warfare. It simply arrived cold and mechanical and made the old rules obsolete overnight. By 1914, every major army had adopted automatic weapons, but none truly understood what they'd unleashed until the first winter, when the Western Front calcified into 400 miles of trenches and the killing stopped making sense in any traditional way. At the heart of this new horror sat the machine gunner, neither hero nor villain, but operator. His was a uniquely terrible war. The mathematics were brutal and simple. A trained rifleman could fire 15 aimed rounds per minute on a good day. A Vickers machine gun, properly served, could fire 450. One man with a Maxim could match the firepower of 30 riflemen, and he could do it for hours if the ammunition held out. The implications redrew every tactical assumption of the previous century. Cavalry charges became mass suicide. Infantry advances became calculated butchery. The machine gun didn't just kill efficiently, it made killing industrial, relentless, impersonal, in a way that broke something fundamental in how men understood combat. To serve behind one was to become the focal point of an enemy's hate. Every gun position drew fire like a magnet. Rifle grenades, trench mortars, artillery of every caliber, snipers who would wait days for a single shot. The machine gunner knew that the moment his weapon opened up, he'd painted a target on himself and everyone near him. Yet he fired anyway, because that was the job. This is the story of that job, and why it was uniquely, systematically horrific. The British Vickers gun weighed 40 pounds without its tripod. Add the 50-pound tripod, and you had a 90-pound burden that required a crew of at least 3 men to move and operate effectively. Its water jacket, surrounding the barrel, held 7.5 pints that would boil during sustained fire, sending steam hissing from the vents. The gun fed from a 250-round canvas belt, and a well-drilled crew could sustain 450 rounds per minute indefinitely, pausing only to change boiled-out barrels or reload. In theory, the Vickers could fire continuously for hours. In practice, it often did. The German MG-08, the military version of Hiram Maxim's original 1884 design, was heavier still, 58 pounds for the gun, 70 for the sled mount it often used instead of a tripod. It fired the 7.92mm Mauser cartridge from 250-round fabric belts, could reach 500 rounds per minute in trained hands, and had earned a reputation for brutal reliability. The MG-08-15, a lighter variant introduced in 1915, weighed only 39 pounds with its bipod and was intended for mobile infantry support, though its water jacket still made it cumbersome. German doctrine called these weapons Maschinengewehr, and they treated them with something approaching religious reverence. The French relied initially on the Hotchkiss Mill 1914, an air-cooled gun that used distinctive brass strips holding 24 or 30 rounds instead of fabric belts. It weighed 55 pounds with its tripod, fired around 450 rounds per minute, and had a slower rate of fire than the water-cooled designs, but compensated with simplicity and reliability in mud. Later, the Chauchat, lighter, less reliable, despised by many who used it, attempted to provide mobile firepower to French infantry sections. The Hotchkiss endured where the Chauchat faltered. The Lewis gun changed the equation entirely when it appeared in numbers after 1915. At 28 pounds loaded, it was light enough for one man to carry and operate, fed from 47-round Pan magazines mounted on top, and used air cooling via an aluminum shroud around the barrel. The British initially dismissed it, but the reality of trench warfare made its mobility invaluable. It could go over the top with advancing infantry, set up in seconds, and provide suppressing fire where the Vickers couldn't follow. Its rate of fire, 500 to 600 rounds per minute, was higher than the Vickers, but the magazine changes created gaps. Still, for frontline infantry, the Lewis was a godsend. Each weapon demanded its own expertise. The Vickers gunner needed to understand the delicate timing of belt feed, the way worn or dirty ammunition could cause stoppages, the exact moment when the jacket water turned too hot and risked warping the barrel. The loader had to anticipate the gun's rhythm, keep belts feeding smoothly, watch for the telltale signs of wear on cloth that had been packed and repacked dozens of times. The third man, sometimes called the number 3 or ammunition bearer, humped the spare barrels, the extra belts, the cans of water and lubricating oil, the tools for field stripping and repairs. He was also the one who'd take over if the gunner or loader died, which happened often enough that crews trained everyone on every role. German MG-08 crews operated under similar principles but with different emphasis. Their doctrine stressed overhead fire and long-range indirect barrages, using the MG-08 almost like light artillery. German machine gunners practiced range estimation obsessively, used intricate range cards marking every fold of ground out to 2,000 yards, and often fired at targets they couldn't directly see based on pre-calculated coordinates. This required mathematics, discipline, and a faith in the system that bordered on fanatical. When it worked, entire British battalions would walk into storms of bullets arriving from multiple directions, each gun perfectly synchronized. The weight, always the weight. A Vickers crew moving into position carried the gun, the tripod, spare barrels, ammunition boxes, each holding 250 rounds and weighing 22 pounds, water in every container they could find, oil, tools, personal weapons, grenades, rations. The loads crushed men into the mud. Moving a gun forward during an advance meant staggering runs between shell craters, 4 men bent double under the burden, praying the next high explosive round wouldn't catch them in the open. Horses and mules helped when terrain allowed, but trenches, wire, craters, and mud defeated animals as thoroughly as men. Then the crew carried it themselves. A machine gun position was never just a hole in the ground. It was engineering, geometry, back-breaking labour, and calculated fields of fire, all compressed into a space barely large enough for 3 or 4 men and their weapon. British doctrine called for emplacements that provided overhead cover, enfilade fire across the front, multiple exit routes, and concealment from both ground observation and aerial reconnaissance. In practice, you got what time and resources allowed, and prayed it would be enough. The ideal Vickers position sat in a reinforced dugout, with walls lined by sandbags, stacked 3 or 4 deep, enough to stop rifle fire and shrapnel, but never enough against direct artillery hits. The gun fired through an aperture, narrow as possible to limit exposure while still allowing traverse. Crews built alternate positions whenever possible, moving between them to confuse enemy spotters. Some positions included concrete, later in the war when semi-permanent defences became standard. Most stayed dirt, sandbags, timber, and desperation. The Germans, masters of defensive doctrine, built fortresses for their machine guns. Deep dugouts 30 feet underground with multiple exits, reinforced ceilings, ventilation, sometimes electricity and telephone lines. Their guns fired from concrete pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire, each position covering the next. At Passchendaele, British and Canadian troops would discover dozens of these positions, camouflaged so perfectly that you could pass within yards without seeing them until the gun opened fire. The MG-08 crews lived in these bunkers for weeks, rotating in and out, maintaining their weapons with an obsessive care that British troops grudgingly respected. Construction started with site selection. The machine gun officer studied the ground, marked out fields of fire on a map, measured ranges, calculated angles. He looked for natural cover, dead ground where enemy infantry might mass, the routes any attack would logically follow. He positioned his guns to kill men funneling into those routes. Then the digging started. In good soil, a basic emplacement took 8 to 10 hours of work for 3 men. In Flanders clay that sucked at shovels and stuck like concrete, it could take 2 days. The gun went in last after the position was ready. Crews test-fired into no man's land at night, marking beaten zones, the area where bullets would fall, and adjusting their aim points accordingly. They filled sandbags with earth from the digging, stacking them in parapets that gave minimal protection and maximal firing arc. They laid duckboards to keep the gun above standing water, piled ammunition boxes within easy reach, hung spare barrels on hooks, placed tools and oil within arm's length. Every detail mattered, because when the gun started firing, there'd be no time to search for anything. Water was a constant obsession for Vickers crews. 7.5 pints boiled away after a few hundred rounds of sustained fire. The crew needed extra water standing by. Petrol cans, wine bottles, canteens, anything that held liquid. In desperate moments, men pissed into the cooling jacket. The alternative was a seized barrel, a dead gun, and an overrun position. One recorded instance from the Somme described a vicar's crew using water from a shell crater that was half corpse soup. The gun didn't care about the water's origin, only that it was wet. Camouflage became art and science both. Fresh sandbags showed bright against weathered positions. Smart crews rubbed dirt into new bags, hung scrim netting if available, planted grass and weeds in the parapet, did anything to break up the geometric lines that drew the eye. German snipers loved machine gun positions. They'd watch for days, memorizing the rhythms of crew changes, waiting for the moment when a gunner's head appeared in the same spot twice. Some British crews painted dummy gun ports on nearby positions, hoping to draw fire away from the real thing. Sometimes it worked. The position became home, prison, potential tomb. Crews lived in or near their emplacements during active periods, sleeping in shifts, eating cold food because smoke drew attention, pissing into bottles or over the back wall, maintaining constant watch. They came to know every inch of their sector, which tufts of grass had been there yesterday, which ones appeared overnight and might hide a German patrol, the spots where enemy artillery always ranged, the times of day when snipers were most active. This intimacy with the killing ground was survival. It was also a special kind of madness. July 1st, 1916 began with sunshine and the rolling thunder of a week-long artillery barrage finally ending. At 7:28 a.m., 2 minutes before 0 hour, British engineers detonated massive mines under German positions at Hawthorne Ridge and elsewhere along the line. At 7:30 a.m. precisely, whistles blew and 13 British divisions climbed from their trenches and began walking toward the German lines. Within minutes, machine guns opened fire and turned mathematics into murder on a scale the world had never witnessed. The German 99th Reserve Infantry Regiment held positions near Auvillers. Their machine gunners had spent the week-long bombardment deep in concrete-reinforced dugouts, emerging only when the barrage lifted to check on their weapons. Most of the guns had survived, protected by 30 feet of earth and concrete. The crews rushed their MG-08s up narrow staircases, manhandled them into pre-prepared firing positions, and found targets immediately. British infantry, advancing in waves as doctrine prescribed, filled the skyline. The gunners didn't need range cards. They simply fired into the mass. Corporal Friedrich Meyer's crew, 119th Reserve Regiment near Beaumont-Hamel, later recorded that they fired continuously for over 30 minutes without needing to change barrels. So steady was their rhythm and so perfect their discipline. They watched British soldiers fall in lines, literally in lines, as their beaten zone swept across the advancing ranks. When one wave was cut down, another appeared behind it. The killing felt mechanical because it was. Pull trigger, observe fall of shot, adjust slightly, continue. The gun did the rest. Unit histories from German regiments describe machine gunners weeping while they fired, nauseated by the slaughter, but unable to stop because British infantry kept coming. The British 1st Battalion Lancashire Fusiliers suffered 576 casualties out of 804 men, a 72% loss rate in the attack's first hour. Machine gun fire caused the majority. The 10th Battalion West Yorkshire Regiment lost 720 men in a similar time frame. The Tyneside Irish Brigade was shredded before reaching the German wire. By 8:30 a.m., an hour into the offensive, nearly 30,000 British soldiers were casualties. By day's end, the number reached 57,470, with 19,240 dead. The machine gun, more than any other weapon, created these statistics. A Vickers gun section from the 29th Division at Beaumont-Hamel fired over 250,000 rounds on July 1st alone, 1,000 belts of ammunition. That's 146 pounds per belt, counting the ammunition box, meaning the crew and their ammunition bearers moved over 70 tons of weight that day in bullets alone. The gun barrels glowed red and had water in the cooling jackets boiled constantly. forcing crews to refill from craters, canteens, corpses, water bottles, anything available. Men's hands blistered from handling hot metal, shoulders bruised purple from humping ammunition, ears bled from the concussion. Still they fired. The horror for German machine gunners wasn't in firing, but in watching what they caused, and knowing they'd pay for it eventually. British artillery, once they identified active gun positions, plastered them with high explosive. A direct hit on a machine gun emplacement didn't leave much to bury. Crews watched their neighbouring positions vanish in eruptions of earth and body parts, knowing their turn would come. Some positions were overrun in later stages of the Somme battles, the crews fighting with pistols and grenades and finally entrenching tools and bare hands when ammunition ran out. Survivors were rare. Private Albert Martin of the 8th Battalion Royal Fusiliers recorded in his diary, later published, his experience running ammunition to a Lewis gun position on July 1st. The team's first gunner was killed by a sniper 20 minutes into the attack. The second took over and kept firing until a shell fragment tore through his shoulder. Martin himself took the gun, having received basic training on it, and fired until the barrel began to warp from sustained heat and the mechanism jammed. He remembered the feeling of the gun bucking against his shoulder, the empty magazines piling up around him, and the certainty that he wouldn't live to see evening. He did, barely, but later wrote that the Lewis gun's continuous chatter still echoed in his nightmares decades afterward. The tactical reality of the Somme demonstrated what military theorists had predicted but commanders had ignored. Modern defensive firepower, centered on machine guns, had made frontal assault obsolete. Yet the attacks continued for months. The Battle of the Somme dragged on until November, each offensive following similar patterns. British and French infantry advanced, machine guns cut them down, artillery eventually suppressed some positions, small gains were made at enormous cost. The British suffered 420,000 casualties during the campaign. Machine guns caused between 40 and 60% of those wounds, according to medical records analysed after the war. By the Somme's end, both sides had learned lessons written in blood. The British refined their creeping barrage tactics, developed better coordination between artillery and infantry, and began using tanks in small numbers. The Germans strengthened their defensive doctrine, building even deeper bunkers, positioning machine guns in even more lethal arrangements, training crews to higher standards. The machine gunners' war intensified rather than improved. More responsibility, more targets, more incoming fire, more death dealt and received. Verdun ground on for 10 months, from February through December 1916, and became synonymous with industrial slaughter. The French and Germans fed men into the battle at rates that made casualty lists meaningless. 700,000 total casualties, roughly equal between the sides, with machine guns accounting for a devastating percentage. The terrain, a hellscape of shattered forests and obliterated villages, forced machine gun tactics to adapt in ways that made the gunners' experience even more nightmarish. The German assault began with a bombardment that dwarfed anything previously seen, over 1,000 artillery pieces firing for 9 hours on a front of 8 miles. When the barrage lifted and German infantry advanced, they moved behind a screen of Stoßtruppen, stormtroopers trained in infiltration tactics, while MG-08-15 crews provided mobile fire support. This was new doctrine, using lighter machine guns as offensive weapons rather than purely defensive tools. It worked initially, pushing the French back through positions like Fort Douaumont and Vaux. French machine gun crews, primarily using the Hotchkiss, held positions that became focal points of defensive stands. At Fort Vaux in June 1916, a single Hotchkiss crew under Sergeant Major Rossetti held a critical corridor for 3 days against repeated German assaults. The gun fired until its barrel glowed, and the brass ammunition strips jammed from heat expansion. The crew, reduced to 3 men, continued firing until they ran completely dry of ammunition, then fought hand-to-hand until overrun. Their resistance bought time for French reinforcements and entered military history as an example of machine gun crews holding beyond any reasonable expectation. The physical environment at Verdun made serving a machine gun nearly impossible and absolutely necessary simultaneously. Artillery had pulverized the landscape into a moonscape of overlapping craters filled with water, mud, poison gas residue, and body pots. Emplacements collapsed constantly. Guns sank into mud overnight, requiring crews to dig them out at dawn. The chalk soil of the region turned into a slippery paste that jammed mechanisms, corroded metal, and made every movement exhausting. Crews rigged shelters from corrugated iron and timber, knowing the next barrage would collapse everything. German MG-08 crews employed overhead fire tactics extensively at Verdun, lobbing bullets in high arcs over friendly troops to fall into rear areas and communication trenches. This required precise calculation and indirect fire tables, essentially using machine guns as light artillery. A single MG-08, firing on fixed lines at ranges beyond 1,500 yards, could interdict an entire section of trenches, making movement during daylight suicidal. French troops learned to move only at night, or in brief windows between barrages, knowing that somewhere out in the German lines, a machine gunner was traversing his weapon across pre-marked coordinates, waiting. The psychological toll at Verdun was particular and crushing. The battle had no clear front line for months, just a zone of death several miles deep where men fought in shell holes and destroyed buildings, often unsure where friendly troops ended and enemy began. Machine gun crews fired at movement, at muzzle flashes, at coordinates on a map, sometimes at nothing, because staying silent meant losing track of your position in the madness. Crews rotated out after days or weeks, replaced by fresh men who inherited exhausted weapons, depleted ammunition stocks, and positions that smelled of cordite, death, and human waste baked into the soil. A unit history from the French 151st Infantry Regiment describes a Hotchkiss crew near Hill 304 in May 1916. The position, a crater modified with sandbags, took a direct hit from a German 150mm shell that killed the gunner instantly and buried the loader under collapsing earth. The number 3, Corporal Jean Moreau, dug out the loader, extracted the gun, miraculously undamaged, and set it up 5 meters away in a fresh crater. He fired alone for 20 minutes, changing magazines as fast as his shaking hands allowed until relief arrived. Moreau was later found sitting beside the gun, catatonic, unable to speak. He recovered physically, but never returned to the front. The German withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line in early 1917 followed sustained French counterattacks that reclaimed much of the ground lost earlier. These counterattacks employed the same brutal mathematics, infantry advancing under creeping barrage while machine guns sought targets. French Hotchkiss crews, now on the offensive side, learned what German gunners had known. Firing into attacking infantry produces a moral injury that outlasts physical wounds. Men who served machine guns at Verdun, on either side, carried a specific trauma. They'd been part of a machine, literally and figuratively, that transformed human beings into casualty statistics at industrial scale. The Third Battle of Ypres, remembered as Passchendaele, lasted from July through November 1917 and represented the absolute nadir of machine gun crew experience. The Flanders plain, naturally waterlogged, had been saturated by the heaviest rainfall in decades. British artillery had destroyed the drainage systems with months of bombardment. The battlefield became a swamp of shell craters, filled with water deep enough to drown wounded men, mud that swallowed equipment and soldiers alike, and German machine gun positions that dominated every slight rise in the otherwise flat terrain. German defensive positions at Passchendaele were engineering masterpieces born of hard experience. Concrete pillboxes, camouflaged to invisibility, held MG-08 crews in relative comfort, while British and Canadian troops drowned in the mud below. These bunkers, often 30 feet underground with reinforced ceilings several meters thick, withstood everything except direct hits from the heaviest caliber shells. The machine guns themselves sat in elevated positions with overlapping fields of fire covering every approach. German doctrine called this defense in depth, multiple lines of machine gun posts, each supporting the others, creating a defensive web that required attackers to fight through layer after layer. The British advance relied heavily on Vickers guns in indirect fire roles, firing over the heads of attacking infantry to suppress German positions. The 100th Machine Gun Company, supporting the attack toward Pilkem Ridge in July, fired over 1 million rounds in a 12-hour period, 4 tons of bullets. The crews worked in shifts, pulling guns that had sunk into the mud back to stable platforms, refilling water jackets from craters containing water of dubious origin, humping ammunition across duckboard tracks that shifted and sank under the weight. Men drowned in the mud carrying ammunition. This wasn't metaphor or exaggeration. They stepped off duckboards into shell craters, sank under the weight of 22-pound ammunition boxes, and the mud swallowed them. Canadian machine gunners attacking toward Passchendaele village in October and November faced the most concentrated defensive fire of the entire war. The German 4th Guards Division and attached machine gun units had transformed every building foundation, every slight elevation, every shell hole into a gun position. Canadian troops from the 1st and 2nd Divisions advanced through fire so dense that survivors described it as a physical wall. Lewis gun teams, supposed to provide mobile support, found their weapons useless. The mud jammed the pan magazines, fouled the mechanisms, made movement impossible. Men tried to fire the Lewis while lying prone in water. The weapon submerged to the stock and wondered why it wouldn't cycle. Private William Green, 2nd Battalion Canadian Mounted Rifles, wrote in a letter home, later donated to the Canadian War Museum, about carrying a Lewis gun through the mud on October 30th, 1917. He described falling into a crater that was deeper than he'd realized, going under completely while still gripping the gun, emerging to find his rifle fouled and the Lewis gun full of mud. His section commander, a sergeant whose name Green didn't record, took the ruined weapon, field-stripped it in waist-deep water while under sporadic fire, and reassembled it functional enough to fire a single magazine before it jammed permanently. Green noted that the sergeant was killed 2 hours later by machine gun fire, and wondered whether that was connected, that the Germans had spotted them while the sergeant worked on the gun. The Vickers guns firing in support roles faced their own hell. Crews established positions on firmer ground behind the advance, often on reverse slopes or in captured German bunkers. They fired predetermined barrages, thousands of rounds traversing and elevating according to timetables, to suppress German positions and provide covering fire. The calculations required mathematics, range, elevation, traverse, rate of fire, duration. The execution required endurance, hours at the gun, changing barrels every 1,000 rounds, the physical beating of sustained fire transmitted through the weapon into bones and teeth. The noise, described by veterans as something between a pneumatic drill and continuous thunder, damaged hearing permanently. Many machine gunners of Passchendaele went partially deaf. The Germans, defending, faced artillery bombardment of unprecedented intensity, plus the constant expectation of attack. MG-08 crews rotated in and out of pillboxes, spending days underground, with the concussion of heavy shells shaking concrete dust from the ceilings. When attacks came, they rushed to positions and fired until barrels glowed or the position was overrun. Unit records from the 54th Reserve Division describe machine gun crews holding positions at Passchendaele until literally surrounded, then fighting to the last man with grenades and pistols. Some crews spiked their guns before surrender, removing firing pins, pouring sand in the mechanisms, denying the weapon to the enemy, even when their own survival was hopeless. The battle achieved limited gains at catastrophic cost. The British and Commonwealth forces suffered approximately 275,000 casualties. The Germans lost perhaps 220,000. Machine guns inflicted between 40 and 50% of the wounds, according to casualty analysis from field hospitals. The village of Passchendaele, when finally captured in November by the Canadian Corps, was a smear of brick dust and mud marked by concrete bunkers. The machine gun pillboxes remained, monuments to defensive doctrine and the men who died serving the guns within. The casualty statistics for machine gun crews were kept separately by some units, and those numbers tell a grim story. British machine gun corps companies, formed in 1915 to concentrate and professionalize machine gun operations, suffered casualty rates between 60 and 70% over the course of the war. Some companies were effectively wiped out twice, rebuilt with replacements, and destroyed again. German machine gun battalions faced similar attrition, particularly during the defensive battles of 1918, when each position became a last stand. Being a machine gunner made you a priority target for everything the enemy possessed. Snipers studied machine gun positions with obsessive patience. A German sniper manual from 1917, captured by Canadian troops, devoted an entire section to identifying and targeting enemy machine gunners. It described watching for steam from water jackets, the glint of brass feed belts, the rhythmic movement of crew members feeding ammunition. It prescribed shooting the gunner first, then the loader, then waiting for the replacement crew and killing them too. This wasn't cruelty, it was sound tactical doctrine. Kill the machine gun and the defense collapsed. Artillery fire on known or suspected machine gun positions was systematic and savage. British and French artillery observers had standing orders to call fire on active enemy guns. German artillery doctrine included dedicated counter-battery fire against machine gun nests. A position that revealed itself by firing could expect a stonk, concentrated artillery fire within minutes if the enemy had functioning observation. Direct hits from 77mm or 18-pounder shells would obliterate a gun emplacement, killing the crew instantly if they were lucky, burying them alive if they weren't. Survivors of near misses described the sensation of the earth lifting beneath them, the world going dark, regaining consciousness buried under sandbags and wondering if they'd been blinded or merely concussed. The physical toll accumulated in ways beyond immediate wounds. The vibration of sustained fire, thousands of rounds, the weapon bucking against its mounts, the tripod legs hammering into the ground, caused nerve damage in hands and arms. Crew members developed tremors that persisted years after the war. The noise level, measured at around 140 to 150 decibels for a Vickers gun firing continuously, caused permanent hearing loss in most gunners. Many finished the war functionally deaf, reading lips and shouting without realizing they were shouting. Sleep deprivation became chronic. Active gun positions maintained constant watch, crews rotating in shifts but never fully resting because the next barrage or attack could come any time. Men slept with the guns rattle as background noise and jerked awake at silence, conditioned to expect incoming fire when the gun stopped. This exhaustion compounded with fear, cold, hunger, and the accumulated stress of daily survival in conditions that turned basic functions, eating, sleeping, relieving oneself, into calculated risks. The moral weight of killing at industrial scale affected machine gunners in ways other soldiers didn't always experience. A rifleman shot at individuals, saw specific targets fall, could rationalize his actions as immediate self-defense. A machine gunner fired into mass formations and watched clusters of men fall, sometimes dozens at a time. The killing was abstract yet visible, impersonal yet undeniable. German machine gunners who'd fired into British attacks at the Somme described nightmares where the endless lines of men kept coming, falling, and rising again. British gunners who'd caught German troops in the open during the 100 Days Offensive carried similar memories. The gun made them efficient killers. Efficiency didn't reduce guilt. Post-war medical records from British military hospitals show that machine gunners were disproportionately diagnosed with neurasthenia, shell shock in the terminology of the day, what we'd now recognize as combat trauma and PTSD. The symptoms were consistent: nightmares, startle responses, shaking hands, inability to tolerate sudden noises, social withdrawal. Many veterans couldn't hold jobs requiring steady hands or quiet concentration. Some self-medicated with alcohol and became statistics in a different kind of casualty list. The ones who adjusted carried the weight silently, rarely discussing their war service, maintaining a distance from the memories that couldn't be shared. One account, broadly paraphrased from multiple war memoirs and unit histories, describes a common experience. The moment after a major action when silence returned and the crew looked around their position. Empty brass casings piled ankle deep. Water in the cooling jacket was brown with rust and whatever else had been available. The barrel, changed multiple times, was too hot to touch even after 10 minutes. And out in front, across no man's land, the ground was covered with bodies, sometimes hundreds of them. The machine gunners had done that. They knew it, the enemy knew it, and when positions were overrun and crews captured, surrender was often not accepted. This was the unspoken reality. To serve a machine gun was to become something the enemy hated with particular intensity, and that hatred occasionally expressed itself in quick bayonets and claims of shot while escaping. The German spring offensive of 1918, launched in March, temporarily broke the stalemate through infiltration tactics that neutralized Allied machine gun positions. German Stoßtruppen bypassed strongpoints, letting follow-on forces reduce them, while MG-08-15 crews provided mobile fire support. The offensive gained more ground in weeks than either side had managed in years, but the machine gun reasserted itself as German supply lines stretched and Allied defences solidified. By summer, the tide had turned. The 100 Days Offensive, beginning in August 1918, saw Allied forces finally developing combined arms tactics that worked. Tanks, artillery, infantry, and aircraft coordinating to suppress machine guns and break through. British machine gun corps units supported attacks with massed indirect fire, sometimes 100 guns firing simultaneously to create standing barrages that suppressed entire sectors. German machine gunners fought delaying actions, each position a calculated sacrifice to buy time for retreat. During the Battle of Amiens in August, British and Commonwealth forces advanced using tank infantry teams that specifically targeted German machine gun nests. The tanks drew fire, located the positions, and suppressed them, while infantry flanked and eliminated the crews. German machine gunners at Amiens faced an impossible equation: fire and reveal your position to tanks you couldn't stop, or stay silent and let infantry advance unmolested. Many chose to fire, fighting until killed or overrun. Their sacrifice slowed but couldn't stop the Allied advance. The psychological shift for German machine gunners during the final months was profound. For 4 years, they'd fought from prepared positions, dominant in defense, confident in their weapons and doctrine. Now they retreated constantly, setting up hasty positions, fighting, withdrawing again. The MG-08 crews became rearguard, sacrificial pieces in a losing game. Some crews were simply abandoned by retreating units, left to hold until overrun because holding gave other units 30 more minutes to fall back. Unit histories from this period are brief and bitter: lists of positions held, men lost, ground surrendered. British and French machine gunners, advancing now, discovered different horrors, moving guns forward under fire, establishing positions in recently captured ground while German artillery still ranged on it, providing covering fire for troops advancing faster than ammunition could be brought forward. The Lewis gun proved invaluable during the 100 days, its mobility allowing gun teams to keep pace with infantry and provide immediate support. Vickers guns followed more slowly, establishing fire bases and then leapfrogging forward as the advance continued. By November 1918, when the armistice took effect, the machine gun had defined World War I more completely than any other weapon. The strategic stalemate, the trenches, the casualty lists, the tactical problems that shaped 4 years of warfare, all trace back to the machine gun's fundamental equation: 1 gun equals 30 rifles, and defense equals superiority. The men who served those guns had become specialists in a new kind of warfare that would shape every conflict afterward. The machine gunners' experience in World War I established patterns that persisted through every subsequent conflict. The specialization, the crew-served weapon requiring teamwork and technical expertise, the role as primary target for enemy fire, all became standard. The psychological burden of firing automatic weapons in sustained combat, causing mass casualties from a single position, proved to be a permanent feature of modern warfare rather than an aberration of the trenches. The statistics tell part of the story. Machine gun fire caused between 40 and 50% of all battle casualties on the Western Front, according to post-war medical analysis. The British fired approximately 250 million machine gun rounds during the war. The Germans probably exceeded that figure. Each round represented a possibility of death, each burst a moment when someone squeezed a trigger and tried not to think too hard about the results. The mathematics of efficiency translated into human costs that couldn't be calculated on spreadsheets. The machine gun's dominance forced military innovation in every direction. Tanks, initially conceived as solutions to trench deadlock, were specifically designed to survive machine gun fire and crush gun positions. Close air support developed partially to attack machine gun nests from above. Artillery doctrine evolved to include suppression of machine guns as a primary mission. Infantry tactics incorporated fire and movement, smoke, grenades, and combined arms specifically to neutralize machine gun positions. The gun shaped everything else. For the men who served them, the machine guns represented a convergence of technology and suffering that made World War I unique in military history. Later wars would be deadlier, more mobile, more destructive in aggregate, but the machine gunner in the trenches experienced warfare at its most concentrated and psychologically corrosive, static positions, exchanging fire for months or years, every man knowing his position and role and fate with grim certainty. The killing industrial and relentless and impossible to escape. The crews rotated out when possible, replaced by fresh men who learned the gun's rhythm and the position's quirks and the weight of the job. They fired when ordered, maintained their weapons with care, bordering on obsession, and lived with the knowledge that survival was statistical rather than earned. Some made it through, most didn't, not intact. The ones who came home carried memories of the gun's rattle, the vibration in their bones, the sight of beaten zones filled with bodies, the certainty that they'd been part of something that couldn't be justified or forgotten, only endured. The machine gun didn't end World War I. Exhaustion, revolution, and American entry did that work. But the machine gun defined it. No other weapon so completely shaped tactics, strategy, and the daily experience of soldiers. No other weapon made the industrial nature of modern war so obvious and inescapable, and no other weapon placed such a specific and terrible burden on the men who served it. They were operators, technicians, and targets simultaneously. The job required courage, but also a capacity to function in conditions that stripped humanity down to its mechanical minimum. Pull trigger, observe fall, adjust continue, survive if possible, remember always. The machine gunner's hell wasn't metaphorical, it was real, documented, and absolutely terrible. This was the war they fought, and these were the weapons that made it uniquely, systematically, industrially lethal. The legacy isn't glory or heroism, though individuals showed both, but rather a hard truth about what happens when killing becomes efficient and men are reduced to components in a system designed for slaughter. The machine gun accomplished that with mechanical precision. The men who operated them paid the price in bodies, minds, and souls. Their experience stands as testament to a kind of warfare the world promised to prevent, and has never quite managed to escape.